Woman's building herself a tomb in that rock. Marcus Holloway said it loud enough for half the canyon to hear, his voice carrying across the red sandstone cliffs like a pronouncement from on high. He sat atop his bay mare, arms crossed over his broad chest, watching the young widow drive her star drill into the canyon wall with steady, rhythmic strikes that echoed through the morning air like a heartbeat made of steel and stone. 3 months later, that same man would kneel at Clara Weston's feet, tears streaming down his weathered face, begging for forgiveness while everything he had ever built lay crushed beneath 4 feet of snow. He would call her the wisest person he had ever known. He would tell his grandchildren about her until the day he died. But on this August morning in 1887, in the remote canyon country of what would eventually become southeastern Utah, Marcus Holloway was certain of only one thing. The widow had lost her mind. The first time Clara Weston struck steel against stone, she thought of her father. She could see him still, standing at the entrance of the Wheelcoats mine in Cornwall, his face blackened with tin dust, his hands rough as the granite he spent his life breaking. The Cornish wind had whipped around them both, carrying the salt smell of the nearby sea. And she had been 7 years old, the same age Ezra was now, asking him why he loved the stone that seemed to hate him so much. Her father had knelt down in the mud, heedless of his worn trousers, and placed a chunk of granite in her small palm. The weight of it surprised her. The coolness of it fascinated her. "Stone doesn't hate, Clara," he had said, his accent thick with the music of Cornwall. "Stone remembers. It holds warmth in winter, coolness in summer. The earth is the best insulator God ever made. Men build with wood because it's easy. But wood burns, my girl. Wood rots. Wood forgets." He had closed her fingers around the stone, his calloused hands enveloping hers completely. "Stone endures." She had carried those words across an ocean, packed alongside her mother's china and her grandmother's quilts in the hold of a ship bound for America. She had carried them across a continent, whispered them to herself during the endless miles of wagon travel, repeated them like a prayer when the prairies stretched so far and so flat that she thought she might fall off the edge of the world. She had carried them through a wedding in Boston, where Thomas Weston had slipped a simple gold band onto her finger and promised to build her a life in the West. She had carried them through the birth of her son, through the long journey to Utah Territory, through 3 years of backbreaking work on a homestead claim that most people said would never amount to anything. And she had carried them through the worst moment of her life, when Thomas lay dying on a bed of blood-soaked quilts, his skull fractured from a fall that should never have killed him, his hand growing cold in hers as she begged God for one more day, one more hour, one more minute. Now 22 years after her father first placed stone in her hand, Clara Weston was finally ready to use what he had taught her. The alcove behind her cabin was a gift from God, or geology, or both. 40 feet wide, 15 feet deep, 20 feet high, it had been carved into the red sandstone by centuries of wind and water. A natural overhang jutted out above it, providing a roof that no carpenter could match. A flat floor of solid rock spread beneath it, needing only to be swept clean of debris. Clara had noticed it on their very first day on the claim, 3 years ago. Thomas had seen it too, had nodded appreciatively and said something about using it for storage someday. But neither of them had truly understood what they were looking at. Clara understood now. The ancestral Puebloans had understood. They had built entire cities into cliffs like this one. Cliff Palace, Spruce Tree House, Balcony House, structures that still stood after 800 years, while the wooden buildings of white settlers rotted and collapsed around them. Those ancient people had known something that modern Americans had forgotten. The earth itself was the greatest builder of all. If it had worked for them, Clara reasoned, it would work for her. She just had to convince everyone else she wasn't insane. Ezra stood beside his mother, holding a bucket of iron spikes, watching her work with the quiet confidence children have when they believe their parents can do anything. At 7 years old, he had his father's dark hair, thick and unruly, forever falling into his eyes, and his mother's gray eyes, the color of storm clouds gathering over the Cornish Sea. He had not smiled since the day they buried Thomas Weston beneath the cottonwood tree by the spring, but he had not complained either. He simply did what needed to be done, day after day, with a stoicism that broke Clara's heart, even as it filled her with pride. He believed in his mother. He believed in her the way he believed in sunrise and gravity and the loyalty of their copper-colored dog. It was not a faith that required explanation or evidence. It simply was. Copper lay in the shade of the cottonwood tree, his rust-red fur gleaming where the morning sun filtered through the leaves. He was 4 years old, a shepherd mix Clara had found wandering the canyon as a half-starved pup 2 winters past. Something had happened to him before they found him. He flinched at loud noises and cowered from raised hands. But he had appointed himself guardian of this small family with a devotion that bordered on the sacred. His intelligent brown eyes tracked every movement around the homestead. When strangers approached, he would rise to his feet, position himself between the newcomers and Ezra, and watch with an intensity that discouraged any thoughts of mischief. He never barked without reason, never bit without cause, but there was something in his steady gaze that made people think twice. "Mama," Ezra said, as Marcus Holloway's laughter echoed off the canyon walls, "why is that man laughing at us?" Clara set down her sledgehammer and wiped the red dust from her face with the back of her hand. Her palms were already beginning to blister, angry red welts rising where the wooden handle rubbed against skin that had spent too many years holding nothing heavier than a pen or a mixing spoon. By the end of the week, those blisters would break and bleed. By the end of the month, they would transform into calluses hard as leather. "Because he doesn't understand what we're building, Ezra." "What are we building?" Clara turned and looked at the alcove. She saw past the debris and the uneven floor and the rough stone walls. She saw what it could become, what it would become if she had anything to say about it. "Somewhere safe," she said quietly. "Somewhere that will still be standing long after Mr. Holloway's barn has fallen down." Marcus Holloway overheard this last comment. His laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by something harder. "Now you listen here, Mrs. Weston," he said, dismounting from his horse and striding toward her with the confidence of a man who had lived in this canyon for 32 years and seen every kind of foolishness the frontier could produce. He was 55 years old, barrel-chested and bow-legged from a lifetime in the saddle, with a beard that had gone from black to gray to white over the decades. "I've got nothing against you. Lord knows you've had more than your share of tragedy, but what you're doing here isn't just foolish. It's dangerous." "Dangerous how, Mr. Holloway?" "You can't carve a barn out of solid rock." He said it slowly, as if explaining something to a child. "It's not possible. Not without proper mining equipment, not without a crew of men, not without years of experience. You're going to hurt yourself." He glanced at Ezra, and his voice softened slightly. "You're going to hurt that boy. And when winter comes and you've got no shelter for your animals, you're going to lose everything Thomas worked for." Clara picked up her sledgehammer again. It felt heavier than it had a moment ago, but she didn't let that show on her face. "My father was a tin miner in Cornwall," she said quietly. "He spent 40 years breaking rock in mines so deep that daylight was just a memory. He taught me that stone isn't the enemy. Stone is the ally. Stone remembers." Marcus stared at her for a long moment, his expression shifting from condescension to confusion to something that might have been concern. "Your father was a miner," he said slowly. "In England." "Yes. And you think that qualifies you to build a barn into a cliff face in Utah territory. I think it qualifies me to try, Mr. Holloway, which is more than most people are willing to do." Marcus shook his head and mounted his horse again, the leather of his saddle creaking as he settled his weight. Behind him, Copper rose from his spot beneath the cottonwood and padded over to stand beside Ezra, pressing his warm body against the boy's legs, his intelligent eyes fixed on the stranger with an expression that needed no translation. "You're wasting your time, Mrs. Weston. You're wasting your strength, and you're making yourself a laughingstock throughout the territory. When winter comes and you've got no barn for your animals, don't say I didn't warn you." He turned his horse and rode away, but Clara could hear him laughing all the way down the canyon, the sound bouncing off the red stone walls until it seemed like the whole world was laughing at her. She stood there until the laughter faded, until the dust settled, until her heartbeat slowed to something approaching normal. Then she raised her sledgehammer and went back to work. That night, after Ezra had fallen asleep with Copper curled at his feet, Clara sat at the rough wooden table Thomas had built during their first winter on the claim. A single candle burned before her, casting flickering shadows across the cabin walls. Outside, a coyote called to its pack, and somewhere in the distance, another answered. She opened the letter she had found in Thomas's pocket on the day he died. She had read it 100 times since then. She had memorized every word, every curve of his handwriting, every place where the ink had blotted, because he had been writing too fast. But she kept reading it anyway, because it was the last thing he had ever written, and because she still didn't fully understand what he had been trying to tell her. Clara, if you're reading this, something has gone wrong. I should have told you sooner, but I was afraid you'd think me paranoid, and maybe I am. But I need you to know the truth. Silas Blackwood has been watching our land. Not the pastures. They're too rocky for serious grazing, and he knows it. Not the timber. There's better stands closer to his own property. He's been watching the spring. I've seen him measuring the flow. I've seen him calculating. That look in his eyes that he gets when he's figured out how to take something that doesn't belong to him. The spring on our claim is the only reliable water source for 5 miles in any direction. In a drought year, it's the only water source, period. That makes it worth more than all the cattle in the territory. If something happens to me, don't sell to him, no matter what he offers, no matter how desperate things get. The spring is worth 10 times whatever he's willing to pay, and he knows it. He's counting on you not knowing. I love you, Clara. I love our boy. I'm sorry I couldn't give you more than this hard land and harder work, but I believe in you. I've always believed in you. Build something that lasts. Thomas. Clara folded the letter and tucked it back into her apron pocket, where it had lived since the day she found it. Thomas had been thrown from his horse while chasing a stray cow 8 months ago. The horse had stepped in a gopher hole at full gallop, had gone down hard, and Thomas had been thrown headfirst into a boulder. He had never regained consciousness, not really. He had lingered for 3 days, breathing but not waking, his hand growing colder in hers with each passing hour. In those final hours he had stirred just once. His eyes had fluttered open, not seeing her, she thought, but seeing something, and his cracked lips had moved, forming words she couldn't hear. She had leaned close, her ear almost touching his mouth, straining to catch whatever message he was desperate to deliver. Spring, water, Blackwood, and then so faint she might have imagined it. Something else. More words. Words that had haunted her for 8 months because she couldn't quite make them out, couldn't quite understand what he had been trying to tell her in those final moments. She had replayed that moment 1,000 times, had tried every combination of words that might fit the shape his lips had made, had wondered if she was remembering it correctly at all, or if grief had twisted her memory into something unrecognizable. But the letter had confirmed at least part of it. Silas Blackwood wanted their water, and Silas Blackwood was a patient man, the kind of man who would wait for winter to do his dirty work for him, who would circle like a vulture until his prey was too weak to fight back. Clara looked out the window at the canyon walls, silver blue in the moonlight. Somewhere out there, Silas Blackwood was waiting. Somewhere out there, Marcus Holloway was telling his wife about the crazy widow who thought she could carve a barn out of solid rock. Somewhere out there, the whole territory was laughing at her. Let them laugh, she thought. Let them all laugh. She would give them something else to talk about before she was done. I want to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been laughed at for believing in something everyone else said was impossible? Have you ever felt that terrible loneliness of knowing you were right when the whole world was certain you were wrong? Have you ever had to keep going anyway, not because you were sure you would succeed, but because giving up would mean losing everything? Hold on to that feeling. Because Clara Weston was about to face 3 months of it. 3 months of mockery, doubt, and backbreaking labor. 3 months of bleeding hands and aching muscles, and neighbors who thought she had lost her mind. But she was also about to discover something else. Something that would change everything. She was about to discover that she wasn't quite as alone as she thought. Silas Blackwood came calling on a Tuesday, when the morning mist still clung to the canyon floor, and the air was cool enough to raise goosebumps on Clara's bare arms. He arrived in a black buggy pulled by match gray horses, the finest animals in the territory, their coats brushed to a shine that seemed almost obscene in this land of dust and hard work. He wore a suit that had been tailored in Denver, charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes, and a hat that probably cost more than Clara spent on food in a month. Silas Blackwood was 48 years old, and he had been prosperous for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to want for anything. He owned 3,000 acres of prime grazing land, 600 head of cattle, and the respect, or at least the fear, of everyone in the territory. He had come west from Philadelphia 20 years ago with a small inheritance and a large ambition, and he had built an empire through a combination of hard work, good timing, and a willingness to do whatever was necessary to get what he wanted. He smiled at Clara the way a cat smiles at a wounded bird. "Mrs. Weston," he said, removing his hat as he stepped down from the buggy. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Mr. Blackwood." Clara kept her hands at her sides, resisting the urge to wipe the rock dust from her dress. She had been working since dawn, and she knew she looked it. Hair escaping from its braid, dress stained with sweat, a smear of red sandstone dust across her cheek like war paint. "What brings you out this way?" "Concern for a neighbor." He glanced past her at the alcove, at the neat row of holes she had drilled into the rock face, at the pile of sandstone blocks she had begun to quarry from a softer section of the canyon wall downstream. His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "I heard you were undertaking quite a project." "I'm building a barn." "So I've heard." He laughed, a rich, warm sound that didn't reach his eyes. "The whole territory is talking about the widow who thinks she can carve a barn out of solid rock. You've become quite famous, Mrs. Weston, or perhaps infamous is the more accurate word. Is that what they're saying?" "Among other things." He stepped closer, lowering his voice as though sharing a confidence between old friends. "Mrs. Weston, I'm going to be honest with you, because I believe you deserve honesty, even if others don't have the courage to provide it. A widow cannot survive out here alone. The winters are brutal, the work is backbreaking, and with all due respect to your late husband's memory, this claim is too remote, too difficult for a woman and a child to manage successfully." Clara said nothing. She simply waited. "I want to help you," Silas continued. He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. "I'm prepared to offer you $400 for your claim. Cash money, Mrs. Weston. You could take that boy back east, give him a proper education, start a new life somewhere civilized, somewhere you don't have to work yourself to death just to survive." Clara looked at the paper but didn't take it. $400. It was more money than she had seen in her entire life. It was also a fraction of what the claim was worth, and they both knew it. "My husband paid $1,800 for this land, Mr. Blackwood. We've put 3 years of labor into it. The claim is worth at least $2,000 on the open market, probably more." "Perhaps." Silas's smile didn't waver, but it hardened somehow, like clay setting in a kiln. "But you're not selling on the open market, are you? You're a widow with no income, no help, and winter coming faster than you might think. $400 now is worth more than $2,000 you'll never see." "No, Mrs. Weston. No, Mr. Blackwood. I'm not selling. Not to you. Not at any price." For a moment, just a moment, the mask slipped. Clara saw what was behind Silas Blackwood's polished exterior. Something cold, something calculating, something that had learned long ago that patience was just another form of predation. Then the mask was back, and he was smiling again. "Think about it," he said, tucking the paper back into his coat. "My offer stands until the first snow. After that, well," he shrugged, a gesture of helpless resignation that didn't fool Clara for a second. "Winter has a way of changing people's minds." He climbed back into his buggy, gathered the reins, and drove away without looking back. Clara watched until the dust settled, until the sound of hooves faded, until she was alone again with her son and her dog and her impossible dream. Then she went back to work. That evening, Clara was preparing supper. Beans and cornbread, the same meal they had eaten every night for weeks, when Ezra came running in from outside. His face was pale, and his breath came in ragged gasps, and for one terrible moment, Clara thought he had been hurt. "Mama!" Mama, come quick! She dropped the wooden spoon and ran after him, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Copper was already outside, barking at something in the distance, his hackles raised along his spine. What is it? Ezra, what's wrong? Ezra pointed toward the road where Silas Blackwood's black buggy had stopped. The man himself was standing beside it, speaking to someone on horseback. His son William, Clara realized. A boy of 14, tall and broad-shouldered for his age, who sat atop a chestnut horse with the easy arrogance of someone who had never been told no in his entire life. I heard them talking, Ezra whispered. Before they saw me. I was collecting firewood by the big rock, and they stopped right there. And Mr. Blackwood said, he swallowed hard and Clara could see the fear in his eyes. Not fear of the man himself, but fear of what his words meant. He said, that spring is worth more than everything else combined. Once winter kills her cattle, she'll have no choice. She'll sell, and she'll be grateful for whatever I'm willing to offer. Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had suspected, of course. Thomas's letter had made it clear, but hearing it confirmed, hearing that Silas Blackwood was actively counting on her failure, actively waiting for the winter to destroy her, was something else entirely. What else did he say? His son asked what would happen if you didn't sell, if you made it through winter somehow. Ezra's voice dropped to barely a whisper. Mr. Blackwood laughed and said, then we wait another year and another. Eventually everyone breaks. It's just a matter of time. Clara stood very still. She could feel her pulse in her temples, could feel the anger building in her chest like a fire that threatened to consume everything it touched. But she didn't let it show. She couldn't afford to let it show, not in front of Ezra, who needed to believe that his mother had everything under control. Ezra, she said quietly, go back inside and finish setting the table. But Mama, go! He went, taking Copper with him. Clara stood alone in the fading light, watching the distant figures of Silas and William Blackwood, watching the buggy finally begin to move again, watching until they disappeared around the bend in the canyon. Then she walked back to the alcove and stood there for a long moment, looking at the work she had done and the work that remained to be done. Silas Blackwood was patient. He had time on his side, resources on his side, the whole weight of wealth and power and respectability on his side. All Clara had was stone, but stone, her father had taught her, was enough. Stone remembered. Stone endured. She picked up her sledgehammer and went back to work. The church social the following Sunday was a disaster. Clara hadn't wanted to go. She was exhausted from a week of dawn to dusk labor. Her hands were raw and blistered, and she knew that nothing good would come from putting herself in front of people who had already decided she was crazy. But Ezra needed to be around other children. He needed some reminder that the world contained more than rock dust and grief and the endless sound of his mother's hammer. And Clara needed to buy supplies that she couldn't make herself. Nails, rope, lamp oil. So she put on her good dress, the green one Thomas had loved, the one that brought out the color in her eyes, and she drove the wagon 3 miles to the small wooden church that served as the community's gathering place. She should have stayed home. You're building a what? Martha Kemp's voice cut through the quiet murmur of conversation like a knife through butter. The woman was 40 years old, stout and loud, and possessed of opinions on everything. She had positioned herself at the center of the social, and her question drew every eye in the room to Clara. A barn, Clara repeated calmly, though her heart was racing. In the alcove behind my cabin, using the cliff face as the back wall and the overhang as the roof. Silence fell over the assembled homesteaders like a blanket of snow. That's, Martha exchanged a glance with her husband Robert, a look that Clara recognized all too well. It was the look people gave each other when discussing someone who had lost their grip on reality. Clara, that's not possible. The ancestral Puebloans did it for centuries. Their structures are still standing after 800 years. Those were houses, Robert said slowly. Small houses for small people, not barns for cattle. The principle is the same. Stone provides natural insulation. The overhang protects from rain and snow. The thermal mass of the rock, Mrs. Weston, Doctor. Ezekiel Crane stepped forward and the crowd parted to let him through. He was the closest thing the territory had to a man of science, a physician who had trained at Harvard Medical School before coming west for his wife's health, which had failed anyway. He still dressed like an Eastern gentleman, and he still spoke with the careful precision of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in any room. "I admire your determination," he said, his voice kind but firm. "Truly I do. But what you're describing is structurally impossible without proper mining equipment and engineering knowledge. And even if you could somehow hollow out that alcove and build walls within it, the thermal conductivity of sandstone would make that space unbearably cold in winter. Your animals would freeze. The rock will keep them warm, Dr. Crane, not cold. My dear woman." He smiled the smile of a man explaining something to a child. "You're talking about physics you don't understand. Stone conducts cold. Everyone knows this." "My father was a tin miner in Cornwall," Clara said quietly. "He worked in tunnels 1,000 feet below the surface, where the air should have been cold as ice. But it wasn't. It was warm, because the earth itself holds heat. Stone doesn't conduct cold, Dr. Crane. Stone stores warmth and releases it slowly. My father taught me this, and he understood stone better than any Harvard professor." A murmur ran through the crowd. Dr. Crane's smile faltered. "Your father was a laborer," he said, "not a scientist. And yet his methods worked. For 40 years they worked, while men with degrees and theories died in mines that were built according to proper engineering." She could feel the mood in the room shifting, but not in her favor. These people didn't want to hear about Cornish mining techniques. They wanted to believe that education and expertise trumped practical knowledge, because that's what they had been taught their whole lives. "I suppose we'll see who's right come winter," Clara said. "If you'll excuse me, I have supplies to purchase." She gathered Ezra and left early, her cheeks burning with a combination of anger and humiliation. Behind her, she could hear the whispers starting up. Poor Clara. Grief has affected her mind. Someone should talk to her about selling before she gets herself and that boy killed. She was loading Ezra into the wagon when a voice stopped her. "Mrs. Weston." She turned, her whole body tense, ready for another confrontation. But the man who stood in the shadows beside the church wasn't any of the skeptics. He was tall and lean, with dark hair silvered at the temples and hands that bore the permanent scars of forge work, burns and calluses, and the kind of marks that came from a lifetime of working with metal and fire. Nathaniel Rivers, the blacksmith, a widower who lived 5 miles distant and rarely spoke to anyone. Clara had seen him at church services and town meetings, always standing apart, always leaving early, always keeping to himself. He held something out to her, a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Your star drill is getting dull," he said. His voice was low and rough, like he wasn't used to using it. "You're having to hit twice as hard as you should. This one's fresh sharpened, holds an edge longer because of the carbon content in the steel." Clara took the bundle, surprised by its weight. She unwrapped it carefully and found 2 star drills inside. Gleaming and new, the cutting tips ground to perfect points. "Mr. Rivers, I can't afford—" "Didn't ask you to pay." She looked up at him, searching his weathered face for some sign of mockery or pity. She found neither. Just a quiet sadness and something else. Something that might have been respect. "Why?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was even rougher than before. "My wife Eleanor built things people said were impossible. A chicken coop with a ventilation system. A root cellar that stayed cool all summer. She wanted to build our whole house into the hillside. Said the earth would keep us warm in winter and cool in summer." He paused. "I didn't listen. Built a regular cabin instead. Drafty, cold." "What happened?" "She got pneumonia the winter of '84. The cabin couldn't hold heat no matter how much wood I burned. I sat with her for 3 weeks, watching her fade, knowing that if I'd just listened—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "She didn't survive the winter, and I've spent every day since wishing I'd trusted her instead of trusting what everyone else said was proper." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back. "I'm sorry." Nathaniel nodded once, acknowledging her words without quite accepting them. "Your father was right, Mrs. Weston. Stone does remember, and the people who mock you now will learn that lesson soon enough." He turned to go, then paused. "If you need tools sharpened, just leave them by the big cottonwood at the edge of your property. I'll find them." Before Clara could respond, he walked away into the darkness. September came to the canyon like a slow exhalation, the fierce heat of summer gradually releasing its grip on the land. The days grew shorter, the nights grew cold, and the cottonwood trees along the creek began their slow transformation from green to gold. And every morning, as the sun painted the red cliffs in the shades of orange and amber, Clara Weston drove her star drill into the rock. The work was brutal. There was no other word for it. Each anchor hole required hundreds of strikes to complete. She would position the star drill against the sandstone, feeling for the grain of the rock the way her father had taught her. Then she would raise the sledgehammer, 8 pounds of iron on a hickory handle, and bring it down with all her strength. The steel would bite into stone, sending up a small puff of red dust. She would rotate the drill a quarter turn and strike again. Rotate, strike, rotate, strike. Hour after hour, day after day. Her hands blistered first, angry red welts that swelled and wept and burned every time she gripped the hammer. Then the blisters broke, leaving raw wounds that stuck to the wooden handle and tore open again with each swing. Then slowly, the wounds began to heal, the skin thickening and hardening until her palms were covered in calluses so tough she could handle hot iron without flinching. Her shoulders ached constantly, a deep, burning pain that radiated down her arms and up her neck. Her back screamed at her every morning when she tried to get out of bed. Her legs trembled at the end of each day, barely able to carry her the 50 feet from the alcove to the cabin. But she kept working, because there was no one else to do it, and because stopping meant losing everything. Ezra helped where he could. He cleared the rock dust from the drill holes with a brush made of horsehair, keeping the holes clean so Clara could see her progress. He fetched water from the spring, carrying buckets that weighed almost as much as he did. He held the star drill steady for the shallower holes, only the shallower ones, where a slipped hammer blow wouldn't cause serious injury. And he asked questions. Endless questions, the way children do when they're trying to understand a world that doesn't make sense. Mama, why do you turn the drill after each hit? To keep the hole round, Ezra. If you hit the same spot every time, you just make a groove. But if you rotate it, you cut a clean circle. Mama, why are you drilling so deep? Because the wooden wedges need room to expand. The deeper the hole, the stronger the anchor. Mama, why do the neighbors say you're crazy? Clara paused at that one, her hammer raised for another strike. She lowered it slowly and turned to look at her son. He was sitting on a flat rock nearby, his small hands wrapped around a cup of water, his gray eyes serious and questioning. Because I'm doing something they've never seen before, she said finally. And people are often afraid of things they don't understand. It's easier to call something crazy than to admit that maybe you don't know everything. Do you know everything, Mama? Clara laughed, a real laugh, the first one in weeks. No, Ezra, I don't know nearly as much as I wish I did. But I know what my father taught me about stone, and I know that the people who built this land into something livable didn't do it by following the rules. They did it by trying things that everyone said were impossible. Ezra thought about this for a moment. Is that what we're doing? Trying something impossible? We're trying something difficult, Clara said. There's a difference. Impossible means it can't be done no matter what. Difficult just means it takes more work than most people are willing to put in. She raised her hammer again and went back to work. The skeptics came in waves throughout September and October, each one eager to observe the crazy widow's progress and offer their unsolicited opinions. Marcus Holloway made a habit of riding by every Tuesday, timing his visits for when Clara was taking her midday break so he could lecture her without interrupting her work, a consideration that might have been thoughtful if his lectures hadn't been so infuriating. Woman's building herself a cave, he announced on his second visit, shaking his head with exaggerated sorrow. Like some kind of animal. A bear, maybe, or a badger. Woman's going to bring that whole cliff down on her head, he predicted on his third visit. That sandstone isn't stable. One good earthquake, and she'll be buried alive. Woman's doing work that would kill a man, he admitted on his fourth visit, and Clara thought she detected a note of grudging respect in his voice. But then he added, and for nothing. That rock won't hold any warmth at all. She's building an icebox and calling it a barn. Billy Tanner, the 22-year-old son of the general store owner, started taking bets. He would ride out to Clara's claim with a group of his friends every Saturday afternoon, ostensibly to check on her progress, but really to mock her and calculate the odds on her failure. $5 says the barn collapses before Christmas, he announced in the middle of October, loud enough for Clara to hear. 3-to-1 odds against the widow making it through winter. Any takers? There were plenty of takers. Reverend Josiah Whitfield rode out to express his spiritual concerns. He was a thin, serious man with a receding hairline and the nervous energy of someone who had never quite found his place in the world. He sat stiffly in Clara's cabin, accepting a cup of coffee he clearly didn't want, and spoke in the careful tones of a man delivering bad news. Mrs. Weston, some members of the congregation have expressed concerns about your project. Concerns, Reverend? It seems, he cleared his throat, it seems pagan, building into the earth like that, like the old cliff-dwelling heathens. Several people have suggested that you might be turning away from Christian values and embracing some kind of primitive spirituality. Clara took a moment to compose herself before responding. She wanted to laugh. She wanted to scream. She wanted to throw the Reverend out of her cabin and never speak to any of these people again. Instead, she said, "The Puebloans weren't heathens, Reverend. They were people trying to survive in a harsh land. They prayed to their gods the same way we pray to ours. And the techniques they developed weren't pagan magic. They were practical solutions to practical problems. Be that as it may, my barn will be made of God's own stone, shaped by hands he gave me, to shelter animals he created. If that's not Christian enough for your congregation, Reverend, I reckon they can take it up with him directly. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." The Reverend left soon after, his concerns unresolved. The cruelest blow came not from the adults, but from their children. It was a Thursday afternoon in early October, the sky clear and blue, the air crisp with the first real bite of autumn. Ezra had gone to fetch water from the spring, a chore he did 3 or 4 times a day now, carrying buckets back and forth while Clara worked on the barn. He was almost to the spring when William Blackwood found him. Silas's son was 14 years old, tall for his age and broad across the shoulders, with his father's cold eyes and a mean streak that came from having too much power and too little consequence. He had grown up knowing that his father owned more land than anyone else in the territory, that his family's wealth could buy anything and anyone, that the rules other people followed didn't apply to him. He had 2 friends with him, boys from other homesteads, sons of ranchers who depended on Silas Blackwood's goodwill for their livelihoods. They followed William the way dogs follow a wolf, eager to please and terrified of being turned upon. "Hey, Cliff boy," William called out, blocking Ezra's path. "Where's your crazy mama? Still digging her cave?" Ezra didn't answer. He kept walking toward the spring, his empty bucket clutched tight against his chest. "I'm talking to you." William stepped directly into his path, close enough that Ezra could smell the tobacco on his breath, a habit he had picked up from the ranch hands and flaunted like a badge of maturity. "My pa says your mama's lost her mind, says she's building a tomb for herself and doesn't even know it. My mama's not crazy." "No?" William smiled, and it was the smile of a cat that had cornered a mouse. "Then why is she living like some kind of Indian, carving holes in rocks like a savage? Everyone says she's going to die this winter, and you with her." "Leave me alone. Make me, Cliff boy." Ezra tried to push past, and William shoved him to the ground. The bucket went flying, clattering against the rocks. Ezra scrambled to his feet, but the other 2 boys grabbed his arms, pinning him in place. William hit him twice, once in the stomach, hard enough to double him over, and once across the face, hard enough to split his lip. "Tell your crazy mama," William said, standing over him, while Ezra gasped for breath, "that my pa's going to own your land by spring, and there's nothing either of you can do about it." They left him there, lying in the dust with his shirt torn and his lip bleeding and tears streaming down his face that he couldn't stop no matter how hard he tried. Ezra walked home slowly. He picked up his bucket. He wiped the blood from his mouth with the back of his hand. He did not cry anymore. He had used up all his tears. But something inside him had changed. Something had hardened. Clara saw him coming from the alcove. She set down her tools and ran to meet him, dropping to her knees in the red dust, gathering him into her arms. "What happened?" Ezra, what happened to you? I fell, he whispered, but she saw the handprint bruise rising on his cheek. She saw the way he wouldn't meet her eyes. She saw the torn collar of his shirt and the split lip and the look of a child who had just learned something terrible about the world. Who did this? Silence. Ezra. Who? William Blackwood. His voice cracked. He said, he said you were crazy. He said we were going to die. He said his pa's going to take our land. Clara held her son for a long time. She didn't speak. She didn't cry, though she wanted to. She just held him while the afternoon sun painted the canyon walls red and gold, while copper pressed his warm body against them both, while the world continued turning, despite the cruelty of children and the patience of men like Silas Blackwood. That night, after Ezra had fallen asleep with Copper curled protectively at his feet, Clara sat at the table and stared at the wall. She could sell. She could take the money and go back east, away from the mockery and the violence and the endless struggle. She could give Ezra a normal childhood, a proper education, a life where he didn't have to fight for every scrap of respect. Or she could finish what she had started. She picked up Thomas's letter and read it one more time. Build something that lasts. In the morning, she went back to work. I need to pause here and ask you something. Right now, Clara has built walls that everyone says will be an icebox in winter. Dr. Crane, a man of science, educated at Harvard, has declared it structurally impossible. The physics, he says, don't work. But Clara's father spent 40 years in the mines of Cornwall, where men survived in tunnels that should have frozen them solid. He knew something that the doctor didn't know. He understood something about stone and earth and heat that Harvard never taught. Do you think stone holds cold or holds warmth? Do you think a Cornwall miner knew more than a Harvard physician? The answer might surprise you. It definitely surprised everyone in that canyon when winter came. Old Jebediah Morrison came to visit in the middle of October. At 72, Jebediah was the oldest man in the territory and one of the few whose opinion Clara actually valued. He had come west as a young man during the first great wave of expansion, had survived Indian wars and droughts and blizzards that killed men half his age, and had accumulated the kind of practical wisdom that can only be earned through decades of experience. He walked with a cane carved from a single piece of juniper, and his eyes, still sharp despite his age, missed nothing. He stood in front of Clara's alcove for a long time without speaking, studying the drill holes she had made in the rock face, the quarried sandstone blocks stacked neatly nearby, the beginnings of the wooden framework that would support the front wall. I saw the cliff dwellings once, he said finally, 40 years ago, up in Mesa Verde. Guide took me through Cliff Palace. Biggest one there is. Whole city built into the rock. 200 rooms at least. Beautiful as anything I've ever seen. Stood for 800 years before white men ever laid eyes on it. Still standing now. That's what I keep telling people, Clara said, but they don't want to hear it. Most people are fools. Jebediah turned to look at her with something like respect. They believe what they're told instead of what they can see with their own eyes. Your father was a miner? Yes. Cornwall. Cornish miners are the best in the world. Only people who know stone better are the Welsh, and they're too stubborn to admit it. He pointed to one of the holes Clara had drilled, where she had begun shaping the opening to receive a wooden anchor wedge. Only Cornish miners carve a wedge slot at that angle. My grandfather was from Cornwall, came over in 1795, mined lead in Missouri before there even was a Missouri. He used to say the same thing your father did. Stone remembers? Stone remembers. Jebediah nodded slowly. And so do I. I remember a lot of things people have tried to forget, like how to survive a winter without fancy buildings and modern conveniences, like how to work with the land instead of against it. He reached out and placed a gnarled hand on Clara's shoulder. Keep building, girl. This will work. I know it the way I know my own name. And when winter comes and everyone else is suffering, they'll understand that you were right all along. You really believe that? I believe what I can see, and I can see that you know what you're doing. He smiled, revealing teeth worn down by 7 decades of frontier cooking. Your father would be proud. Clara had to turn away then, because the tears she had been holding back for months finally threatened to spill over. When she had composed herself enough to speak, she asked, "Will you come back to see it when it's finished?" "I'll come back in spring," Jebediah said, "and I'll bring a bottle of my best whiskey. We'll toast to your success while everyone else is still picking up the pieces from whatever winter throws at them." He patted her shoulder once more and walked slowly back to his wagon, his cane tapping against the rocky ground. Clara watched him go, feeling something she hadn't felt in months: hope. The gifts continued to appear throughout October and November. Clara would wake before dawn, walk out to the alcove to begin the day's work, and find something waiting for her. Her tools arranged neatly on a flat rock, freshly sharpened and oiled. A coil of new rope, high-quality hemp strong enough to lift the heavy beams she would need to install. A bag of iron nails, a sack of lime for making mortar. There was never a note, never a sign of who had left these things. But Clara noticed that Nathaniel Rivers's forge glowed late into the night more often than it used to. And when she drove past his property on her way to church, she sometimes caught him watching from his workshop door. She never thanked him directly. She didn't know how, didn't know what words could possibly express what his quiet help meant to her. But she began leaving a loaf of fresh bread on his fence post every Friday, wrapped in a clean cloth, and every Saturday the loaf was gone, and the cloth was folded neatly on the post. It was a strange kind of courtship, conducted in tools and bread and silence, but it was enough. Young Sarah Garrett started coming by in late October. She was 16 years old, the daughter of homesteaders who lived 2 miles to the east, and she had the kind of curious intelligence that asked why when everyone else accepted because. She had heard about Clara's barn at church, had heard the mockery and the predictions of failure, and she had decided to see for herself. "Teach me," she said on her third visit. "I want to learn how to do this." "Why?" "Because everyone says it can't be done." Sarah's chin lifted, revealing a stubbornness that reminded Clara of herself at that age. "And I don't believe them." So Clara taught her. She showed her how to read the grain of sandstone, how to find the natural planes where rock wanted to split. She explained the physics of thermal mass, how stone absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night, maintaining a stable temperature while the air outside swung from hot to cold and back again. She demonstrated the star drill technique, the mortar mixing, the careful art of laying stone upon stone in courses that would stand for centuries. Sarah absorbed it all like water into dry earth. "Someday," she said, watching Clara set a capstone on the front wall, "I'm going to build something like this, maybe bigger, maybe better." "You'll do more than that," Clara said. "You'll teach others. That's how knowledge survives, not in books that gather dust on shelves, but in hands that remember how to do the work." The accident happened on a Thursday in late October, when the air was crisp with the promise of snow and the cottonwood leaves had turned to gold. Clara was installing the main support beams, massive ponderosa pine logs that Thomas had cut the previous spring, each one weighing close to 300 pounds. She had rigged a pulley system using the rope that had mysteriously appeared on her doorstep, anchoring it to the stout trunk of the cottonwood tree. The system allowed her to raise each beam slowly, inch by inch, using her body weight as a counterbalance. It was dangerous work. She knew it was dangerous, but she couldn't afford to hire help, and she couldn't afford to wait for someone to offer. Winter was coming, and the beams had to be in place before the first snow. She had raised the largest beam nearly to its final position when the rope snapped. Later, she would remember the sound, a sharp crack, like a rifle shot, followed by the deeper groan of wood under stress. She would remember Ezra's scream, high and thin and terrified. She would remember Copper's frantic barking and the rush of air as the beam swung free, and the terrible certainty that she was about to die. She shoved Ezra out of the way. That was instinct, pure and simple. The knowledge that her son was more important than anything, that protecting him was the only thing that mattered. She felt his small body in her hands, felt the force she used to throw him to safety, and then the beam caught her shoulder and everything went white with pain. She hit the ground hard, her head struck stone, and then there was nothing but darkness. She woke to warmth. Someone had wrapped her in blankets. Someone had lit a fire nearby. She could hear it crackling, smell the smoke mingling with the scent of coffee and leather, and something else. Something that reminded her of her father's workshop back in Cornwall. Someone was pressing a cool cloth to her forehead, wiping away the blood from a gash above her eyebrow. "Easy," a man's voice said. "Don't try to move yet." Clara opened her eyes. Nathaniel Rivers sat beside her, his weathered face drawn with concern, his scarred hands gentle as he tended her wound. Behind him, Ezra sat huddled with Copper, both of them watching her with identical expressions of terrified relief. What? What happened? The rope broke. Beam caught your shoulder and knocked you down. Nathaniel's voice was low and rough, but his hands didn't shake as he checked her pupils for signs of concussion. Nothing's broken, far as I can tell, but you've got a gash on your head that needed stitching, and your shoulder's going to be purple for a month. The beam didn't hit you square, clipped your shoulder and spun you around. If it had hit you straight on, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Clara tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Pain lanced through her shoulder, sharp and bright, stealing her breath. I said don't move. Nathaniel pressed her gently back down. You need rest. A week at least, maybe 2. I can't rest for 2 weeks. Winter is coming. The barn can wait. It can't. You don't understand. If I don't finish before the snow, Mrs. Weston. Nathaniel's voice was firm but kind, the voice of a man who had learned the hard way when to push and when to yield. Your son needs his mother more than those cattle need a barn. You're no good to anyone dead. Clara wanted to argue. She wanted to explain about Silas Blackwood in the spring, about Thomas's letter, about the desperate race against time she had been running since August. But the pain in her shoulder was making it hard to think, and Ezra was crying quietly in the corner, and suddenly it all seemed like too much. How did you know to come? She asked instead. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. I wasn't just passing by, if that's what you're asking. I've been checking on you, from a distance, making sure you were... He stopped, seemed to struggle with the words. Making sure you were all right. Why? He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Clara saw something in his eyes that she hadn't expected. Not pity, not condescension. Something deeper, something that looked almost like recognition. My wife, Eleanor, he said slowly. She was like you, determined, stubborn. Did things people said were impossible just to prove they were wrong. She wanted to build our whole house into the hillside behind our property. Said the earth would keep us warm in winter and cool in summer. Said it was the natural way, the way people had built for thousands of years before we forgot. What happened? I didn't listen. His voice grew rough. I was young and proud and certain I knew better. Built a regular cabin instead. Proper walls, proper roof, proper everything. Drafty as hell and cold as a tomb when winter came. She got sick. Pneumonia. The winter of '84. Nathaniel stared at his hands, at the scars from a lifetime of forge work. I sat with her for 3 weeks, feeding the fire day and night, trying to keep her warm. But the cabin couldn't hold heat no matter how much wood I burned. She just faded a little more each day. And I knew that if I just listened to her, if I just built what she wanted instead of what I thought was right. He stopped, swallowed hard. I'm sorry, Clara whispered. Don't be sorry for me. I made my choice, and I've lived with it every day since. He looked up at her again. But watching you these past months, watching you build something everyone says is impossible, it's like watching Eleanor work, and I won't let you fail the way I let her fail. Not if there's anything I can do to prevent it. He stood and moved toward the door, his movement stiff with emotions he wasn't ready to name. I fixed your pulley system, he said without turning around. Replaced the rope, added an extra anchor point, reinforced the whole thing. It won't fail again. Nathaniel, get some rest, Mrs. Weston. You've got a barn to finish. He was gone before she could find the words to thank him. That night, Clara dreamed of Thomas. He stood in the finished barn, though it was not yet finished in waking life, surrounded by warm light and the peaceful sounds of contented animals. The walls rose around him, solid and eternal, and he looked at them with an expression of quiet pride. You're doing it, he said. You're really doing it. I don't know if I can. Clara's voice echoed strangely in the dream space. Everyone says it's impossible, even the people who should know better. Since when do you care what everyone says? She wanted to touch him. She wanted to feel his arms around her one more time, wanted to press her face against his chest and breathe in the scent of him and believe for just a moment that none of it had happened, that he was still alive, that they still had time. But dreams don't work that way. She knew that if she reached for him, he would dissolve like morning mist. "I couldn't hear you," she said instead. "At the end. I tried so hard, but I couldn't hear what you were trying to tell me." Thomas smiled. "Yes, you did. You just didn't believe it. Spring, water, blackwood. That was the warning. But that wasn't the important part." Clara felt tears running down her cheeks, warm and wet and real in a way that nothing else in the dream was real. "Then what was? Thomas, please. I've been trying to remember for 8 months. What were you trying to tell me?" He stepped closer. She could almost feel his warmth now, could almost smell the sawdust and leather that had always clung to his clothes. "You can do this, Clara," he said. "You always could. You never needed me to believe in you. You just needed to believe in yourself." She woke with tears on her pillow and her shoulder aching, and dawn light creeping through the cabin window. But for the first time since Thomas died, she felt certain. Not hopeful, not determined, certain. She was going to finish that barn. And nothing, not the pain, not the skeptics, not Silas Blackwood and all his patient scheming, was going to stop her. Clara's shoulder healed slowly through the final weeks of October and into November. She couldn't swing the sledgehammer for nearly 2 weeks, and even after the swelling went down, her range of motion remained limited. But she adapted. She learned to use her left arm for tasks that had always been done with her right. She developed new techniques for moving heavy stones, using leverage and gravity instead of brute strength. And on the days when the pain was too great for heavy work, she focused on smaller tasks, mixing mortar, shaping wedges, teaching Ezra the skills he would need to carry on if anything happened to her. The barn took shape day by day, stone by stone. The front wall rose slowly through October, each course of sandstone blocks fitted carefully into place and mortared with the lime mixture Clara had learned to make herself. The mortar had to be mixed fresh each day, 3 parts sand, 1 part lime, just enough water to make it workable, and applied quickly before it began to set. The wooden framework went up in early November, the massive beams that Thomas had cut finally finding their purpose. Clara used Nathaniel's improved pulley system to raise them into position, moving slowly and carefully, checking each rope and anchor point 3 times before trusting her weight to it. The door took a week to build, heavy planks of pine, joined with wooden pegs and hung on wooden hinges that Clara had carved herself from oak. Iron hinges would have been better, but iron cost money she didn't have. The wooden hinges worked well enough, though they creaked when the door swung open. The windows were oiled canvas stretched over wooden frames, translucent enough to let in light, but sturdy enough to keep out weather. They could be rolled up in good weather for ventilation, or fastened down tight when storms came. By the first week of November, the barn was essentially complete. It wasn't beautiful, Clara knew that. The front wall was rough-hewn sandstone, fitted together with more determination than skill. The mortar lines weren't perfectly straight. The door hung slightly crooked on its wooden hinges. But it was solid. It was real. And when Clara stood in the center of the space on a cold November morning, surrounded by walls of stone that she had built with her own bleeding hands, she felt something shift in her chest. The interior was better than she had dreamed. Stone dividers created separate stalls for the 4 cows, a pen for the 2 pigs, a roosting area for the 12 chickens. A hayloft, built on a platform of small logs, held enough feed to last through the worst winter. The natural rock floor, covered with packed earth and fresh straw, stayed remarkably dry even when rain fell outside. And it was warm. That was the thing that surprised her most. Even on cold mornings when frost covered the ground outside and her breath made clouds in the air, the inside of the barn stayed comfortable. The massive sandstone walls absorbed heat during the day, from the sun, from the animals, from Clara's own body as she worked, and released it slowly through the night, just as her father had promised, just as Eleanor Rivers had known, just as the ancestral Puebloans had discovered 800 years ago. Clara led her animals into the barn on November 5, 1887. The cows went first, their hooves echoing on the stone floor, their breath steaming in the morning air. Then the pigs grunting and snuffling. Then the chickens, clucking nervously as they explored their new roosting area. They settled in quickly. Animals know when they're safe. They can sense shelter the way humans sense danger. And within hours, the barn that everyone said was impossible had become home. Ezra found Clara standing in the center of the space, tears streaming down her face, watching the dust motes dance in the light that filtered through the canvas windows. "It's beautiful, Mama," he said. "It's ours," she whispered. "It's really ours." The first test came in mid-November. A cold snap swept through the canyon, dropping temperatures to 15 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. Clara woke before dawn, her heart pounding with anxiety, and hurried to the barn with Ezra and Copper at her heels. She had borrowed Dr. Crane's thermometer, the good one, the one he used to measure fever in his patients. Her hands shook as she pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The warmth hit her like a physical force. She stood there for a long moment, hardly daring to believe it. The air inside the barn was comfortable. Not hot, not cold, but comfortable. The cows stood placidly in their stalls, chewing their hay. The chickens roosted on their perches, fluffed against the chill but not distressed. The pigs were piled together in their pen, sleeping peacefully. Clara checked the thermometer 3 times, certain she had misread it. 45 degrees inside, 15 degrees outside, a difference of 30 degrees, with no fire, no stove, nothing but the body heat of the livestock and the thermal mass of the sandstone walls. Her father had been right. Eleanor Rivers had been right. She had been right. Old Jebediah Morrison stopped by a week later, as he had promised. He walked through the barn slowly, his juniper cane tapping against the stone floor, his sharp eyes examining everything. He ran his gnarled hands over the walls, testing the mortar. He checked the beam anchors. He examined the door hinges. He looked at the way Clara had positioned the livestock stalls to maximize warmth and minimize drafts. When he was finished, he stood in the center of the barn and nodded once. "Your father would be proud," he said. Clara couldn't speak. "Winter's coming," Jebediah continued. "Bad one, if my bones are any judge. Worst in years, maybe worst in my lifetime. But you'll be all right. This place will stand through anything nature can throw at it." He turned to look at her, and his weathered face creased into a smile. "You did it, girl. You did the impossible. And come spring, everyone who laughed at you is going to be lining up to learn your secrets." "Will you teach them with me?" Clara asked. "Help them understand?" "I'll do better than that." Jebediah reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. "I've been writing down everything you've done. Every technique, every measurement, every trick your father taught you. When this winter's over, I'm going to make sure this knowledge doesn't die with us." He pressed the notebook into her hands. "Some things are too important to be forgotten," he said. "This is one of them. Here's something I've learned about people who accomplish impossible things. They never do it alone. Even when the whole world seems against them, there's always someone who sees the truth. Someone who believes. Someone who helps in ways big and small, often without being asked, often without expecting thanks." For Clara, those someones were a 72-year-old frontiersman with a juniper cane, a silent blacksmith with a broken heart, and a 16-year-old girl with questions. They weren't enough to make the work easy. Nothing could have done that. But they were enough to make it possible. And sometimes, that's all we really need. It began on December 23rd, 1887. The day started like any other winter day. Gray skies pressing down on the canyon, bitter wind whistling through the gaps in the cabin walls, the smell of snow hanging in the air like a promise or a threat. Clara fed the animals, checked the barn's temperature, a comfortable 42 degrees, and went about her usual chores. By noon, the first flakes were falling. By evening, the wind had risen to a howl, and the flakes had become a wall of white so dense that Clara couldn't see the barn from her cabin door, a distance of barely 50 feet. By midnight, she knew this was no ordinary storm. The blizzard that struck the Utah Territory on December 23, 1887, would later be called the worst in 50 years. Historians would record that it killed 67 people across 4 counties. They would note that it destroyed hundreds of structures, barns, cabins, sheds, anything built of wood that dared to stand against its fury. They would calculate that the temperature dropped to 35 degrees below zero, that the wind blew at speeds exceeding 70 miles per hour, that more than 4 feet of snow fell in 5 days. but statistics couldn't capture what it was like to live through it. The wind didn't just blow, it screamed. It hammered against the cabin walls with a force that made the whole structure shudder. It found every crack and gap and weakness, driving snow through spaces that should have been too small for air to pass. It made sounds that weren't quite human, but weren't quite animal either. Sounds that crept into Clara's dreams and turned them into nightmares. The cold was beyond anything she had ever experienced. This wasn't the crisp bite of a normal winter day. This was cold as a weapon, cold as a predator, cold as death itself reaching through the walls to claim everything it could touch. Water froze in the bucket before Clara could carry it across the room. Bread turned to stone overnight. The air itself seemed to solidify, resisting every breath, and the snow kept falling. Day 1, Day 2, Day 3. Clara kept the fire burning constantly, feeding it throughout the day and night, burning through firewood at a rate that terrified her. She had stockpiled what she thought was enough for the whole winter, but at this rate, it would be gone by February, if they survived until February. On the second day, she knew she had to check on the animals. They had food and water in the barn, but she needed to see them, needed to know if her barn, her impossible, crazy, everyone said it wouldn't work barn, was keeping them alive. She bundled herself in every piece of clothing she owned, 2 pairs of wool stockings, 3 petticoats, her heaviest dress, Thomas's old coat that still smelled faintly of him, a wool scarf wrapped around her face until only her eyes showed. Then she opened the cabin door and stepped into hell. The wind hit her like a physical blow, staggering her backward. Snow drove into her face, into her eyes, into the gaps in her clothing. She couldn't see anything, not the barn, not the cottonwood tree, not even her own hand in front of her face. She had strung a rope between the cabin and the barn for exactly this reason, an old frontiersman's trick that Thomas had taught her. She found it by feel, grabbed hold with both hands, and began to pull herself forward. 50 feet. It should have taken 30 seconds. It took 15 minutes. By the time she reached the barn door, her fingers were numb, her face was burning with cold, and she was fairly certain she had frostbite on her nose. But she was there. The barn door was sheltered by the natural overhang of the cliff, the same overhang that had convinced her to build here in the first place. Only a light dusting of snow had accumulated against it. She pulled it open, stepped inside, and pulled it closed behind her. And then she fell to her knees and wept. It was warm, not just above freezing, not just bearable. Warm. The temperature inside the barn was 42 degrees, the same temperature it had been every day since she finished building. The same temperature it would remain throughout the storm, throughout the winter, throughout all the years to come. Outside, 35 degrees below zero. Inside, 42 degrees above. A difference of 77 degrees. The cows stood placidly in their stalls, chewing their hay, their breath steaming gently in the air. The chickens roosted on their perches, fluffed and content. The pigs were piled together in their pen, sleeping the deep sleep of animals who knew they were safe. The massive sandstone walls rose around her, ancient and eternal, holding the warmth of the earth itself against the fury of the storm. The overhang of rock blocked the wind. The stone floor, covered with packed earth and straw, stayed dry while rivers of snow buried the world outside. Clara sat in the straw for a long time, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of her animals, feeling the warmth of the rock against her back. Her father had been right. Eleanor Rivers had been right. The ancestral Puebloans had been right. Stone remembered. Stone endured. Stone protected. On the third day, Clara heard the sound. At first she thought it was thunder, an explosion of noise that cut through the wind's roar like a gunshot. But thunder didn't come in winter. Thunder didn't repeat itself, didn't grow closer, didn't multiply into a chorus of destruction. Then she understood. Buildings were collapsing. All across the canyon, all across the territory, barns and sheds and shelters that had been built the proper way, with lumber and nails and right angles, were failing. Roofs that couldn't bear the weight of 4 feet of snow. Walls that couldn't withstand 70-mile-per-hour winds. Structures that had been built to look impressive rather than to endure. Clara stood at her cabin window and watched the destruction she couldn't see, listening to the sounds of a community being torn apart. I need to ask you something. Think about the coldest winter of your life. Not just the temperature, though that matters, but the cold that seeps into your bones, that makes you question whether spring will ever come again. The cold that tests everything you've built and everyone you love. Now imagine that cold multiplied by 10. Imagine knowing that people are dying out there in the storm, people who laughed at you, people who mocked you, people who predicted your failure. What would you do if those people came to your door, begging for help? Would you turn them away? Would you remind them of everything they said, every cruel joke and condescending smile? Or would you do what Clara Weston did? Silas Blackwood arrived on the fourth day of the storm. The blizzard had paused briefly, not stopped, just caught its breath before the next assault. And in that window of relative calm, Clara heard pounding at her cabin door. She opened it expecting to find one of her neighbors seeking shelter. What she found was the richest man in the territory, on his knees in the snow. Silas Blackwood's fine suit was torn and crusted with ice. His face was white with frostbite, his lips cracked and bleeding, his eyes wild with a desperation Clara had never seen in him before. Behind him, barely visible through the swirling snow, she could see others: Marcus Holloway, Robert Kemp, the Morrison family, the Williams family from 4 miles away. A dozen people clutching children and bundles of possessions, their eyes wide with the particular terror of those who have lost everything. Mrs. Weston. Silas's voice cracked with cold and something else, something that might have been shame. My barn collapsed. The roof gave way under the weight of the snow. My cattle are trapped. My wife and children. He stopped, swallowed hard. We have nowhere to go. Clara looked at him, really looked at him. This was the man who had tried to steal her land, the man whose son had beaten her boy, the man who had waited patiently for winter to destroy her, who had smiled at church while her neighbors whispered about her madness, who had calculated the odds of her failure the way other men calculated the odds of rain. She thought about Thomas's letter, about the spring, about all the cruel words and colder silences, about Ezra's split lip and bruised cheek and the look in his eyes when he said William Blackwood's name. She could turn him away. She had every right, every reason. But she also thought about Agnes Blackwood, who had whispered cruel things at church but was still someone's wife, someone's mother. About the children huddled behind their parents, too cold and too scared to cry. About Thomas's voice in her dream, telling her that she could do this, that she always could. Bring everyone, she said. The barn can hold them all. They came like refugees from a war. 17 people crowded into Clara's cabin that night, sleeping on the floor, sharing body heat, burning through the last of her firewood. The children cried. The adults prayed. Copper moved among them like a furry guardian angel, offering his warmth to whoever needed it most. The next morning, when the brief calm continued, Clara led them to the barn. The walk was only 50 feet, but in the aftermath of the storm, it felt like miles. They moved in a chain, each person holding the coat of the one in front, fighting through drifts that had piled higher than their heads. When Clara pushed open the barn door, the gasp that went through the group was audible even over the wind. Warmth, light filtering through the canvas windows, the peaceful sounds of livestock, and everywhere the massive presence of stone. They poured inside like water through a broken dam. For 2 days they lived together in the barn. There was no privacy, no comfort beyond the basic miracle of warmth, no food beyond what Clara had stored for her animals, and the meager supplies her neighbors had managed to carry through the storm. But there was life. There was hope. There was the slow, grudging realization that everything they thought they knew had been wrong. Dr. Crane moved through the space with his thermometer, taking measurements, shaking his head in disbelief. 48 degrees, he announced. No fire, no stove, no heat source of any kind beyond the animals themselves. 48 degrees when it's 35 below zero outside. He looked at Clara with something that might have been wonder. This is remarkable. It's physics, Clara said quietly. The physics you told me I didn't understand. Dr. Crane had the grace to look embarrassed. Think of it like a massive stone hearth, she continued. It soaks up warmth from every source, from the sun on good days, from the animals all the time, even from our own bodies right now. And it radiates that warmth back slowly through the coldest nights. My father called it the Earth's embrace. The people who lived here before us called it home. Dr. Crane was silent for a long moment. Mrs. Weston, he said finally, I owe you an apology. I was thinking like a Boston physician instead of thinking like a Cornwall miner's daughter. I appreciate that, Dr. Crane. I was wrong. About everything. He looked around at the walls of stone, at the peaceful animals, at the refugees who had found shelter in a place everyone had called impossible. And I will spend the rest of my days telling everyone who will listen that I was wrong. Marcus Holloway found Clara on the second evening. She was sitting in the corner of the barn, watching Ezra play with the younger children. The boy had taken on the role of entertainer, telling stories and playing games, keeping the little ones distracted from their fear. Copper lay nearby, his head resting on the lap of a 6-year-old girl who had cried for most of the first day, but had finally stopped when the old dog settled beside her. Mrs. Weston. Clara looked up. Marcus stood before her, his hat clutched in both hands, his weathered face working through emotions she had never seen him display before. Mr. Holloway, I need to say something to you. His voice was rough, like rocks scraped from the earth. And I need you to listen, because I'm not sure I have the courage to say it twice. I'm listening. I called you crazy. I said you were building yourself a tomb. I laughed at you in front of everyone we know, every chance I got for 3 months straight. He swallowed hard. I was wrong. About you, about your barn, about everything. Yes, Clara said quietly. You were. I don't know how you can ever forgive me. I'm not sure I would, in your place. He took a deep breath. But I need to ask anyway. And then Marcus Holloway, proud, stubborn Marcus Holloway, who had lived in this canyon for 32 years and never apologized for anything in his life, did something Clara never expected. He knelt, right there in the dust and straw of her barn floor, in front of everyone who had taken shelter in her impossible creation. The man who had laughed loudest and mocked longest went down on both knees like a supplicant before a queen. We were all wrong, he said, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. You built the only thing that could save us, and you did it while we were betting on your failure. While I was betting on your failure. He looked up at her, and his eyes held nothing but raw, painful honesty. You are the bravest person I have ever known, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the grace you've shown by letting us in here. Clara felt her own eyes fill with tears. She stood. She reached down, and she took Marcus Holloway's rough, calloused hands in her own and pulled him to his feet. We're neighbors, she said. We're going to need each other long after this storm passes. I'd rather face the future as friends than as enemies. Marcus nodded, unable to speak. Besides, Clara added, I'm going to need help teaching everyone else how to build these barns, and I hear you're pretty handy with a sledgehammer. He laughed, a real laugh, the first one she had ever heard from him that wasn't at someone else's expense. Yes, ma'am, he said. I reckon I am. Silas Blackwood came to her later that night, when most of the refugees had fallen into exhausted sleep and only the animals were still awake. I need to tell you something, he said quietly. Something I should have told you months ago. Clara waited. I wanted your land, not because it was valuable, though it is, but because your spring is the only reliable water source for 5 miles in any direction. In a drought year, whoever controls that spring controls the whole territory. I know. Thomas figured it out before he died. He left me a letter. Silas nodded slowly. He was smarter than I gave him credit for. Smarter than most people. Yes, he was. I was waiting for you to fail. Silas's voice was flat, emotionless. The voice of a man confessing sins he had long since stopped trying to justify. I was counting on this winter to destroy you, to kill your livestock and break your spirit and drive you into my arms for whatever price I was willing to pay. I know that too. And now here I am, standing in the barn you built against all odds, warm and safe while everything I built has collapsed into rubble. He laughed bitterly. My wife says if I don't apologize, if I don't make this right somehow, she's taking the children and going back to Denver. And she's probably right to go. I've become someone I don't recognize. Clara watched him for a long moment. Mr. Blackwood, I don't want your apology. Not for me. Then what do you want? I want you to help rebuild what this storm destroyed. Not just your barn, everyone's barn. I want you to use your money and your influence and your 3,000 acres to help this community survive instead of trying to pick its bones. And if I do that, then we move forward. All of us. Together. Silas was quiet for a long time, staring at the stone walls that had saved his life. I can do that, he said finally. I can try. The storm broke on December 28, 1887, revealing a world transformed. Clara emerged from her cabin to find a landscape of devastation and beauty. The snow lay in drifts higher than her head, glittering white under a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. The air was still and cold, but the wind had finally died, and the silence was almost as overwhelming as the storm had been. The canyon looked like a battlefield. Marcus Holloway's barn, the proper barn he had built with lumber and nails and right angles, lay flattened beneath 4 feet of snow. Robert Kemp's barn had lost its entire north wall. The Morrison family's livestock shelter had been ripped apart by the wind and scattered across half a mile of frozen ground. But the rock barn stood unchanged. Not a stone had shifted, not a beam had cracked. The door hung straight in its wooden hinges, and the animals inside were as comfortable as they had been 5 days ago. Word spread quickly. Over the following weeks, homesteaders from miles around came to see the barn that had survived the worst storm in 50 years. They walked through slowly, touching the walls, studying the construction, asking questions they had been too proud to ask before. Clara answered them all. She demonstrated her techniques, explained her reasoning, shared everything her father had taught her and everything she had figured out on her own. If I'm the only one who knows this, she told Sarah Garrett, who had come to help with the teaching, then it dies with me. But if we teach others, it lives forever. 4 families rebuilt their barns using Clara's techniques that spring. Marcus Holloway built his new barn into a hillside, backing it against the earth for insulation and protection. Robert Kemp used more stone and less timber, creating a hybrid structure that combined traditional and innovative approaches. Even Billy Tanner, who had lost $5 betting against Clara, came to her for advice on reinforcing his family's livestock shelter. Silas Blackwood proved true to his word. He funded the purchase of tools and materials for families who couldn't afford them. He organized work parties to help with construction. He used his influence to bring in experts who could teach masonry and stonework. He never apologized directly to Clara again, but every time she saw one of his wagons loaded with supplies for a neighbor in need, she understood that he was apologizing in the only way a man like him knew how. Nathaniel Rivers came for dinner on Easter Sunday. It was the first time he had been inside Clara's cabin since the night of her accident. He sat at her table with his hands folded, watching Ezra play with copper, watching Clara move from stove to table with the easy grace of a woman comfortable in her own home. "You're a good cook," he said when the meal was finished. "My mother's recipes. She brought them all the way from Cornwall, written in a book that barely survived the voyage." Clara smiled. She would have liked this place. The way the light comes through the windows in the evening. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "Eleanor would have liked you," he said. "She would have said you were the kind of woman who builds things that last." "That's kind of you to say." "It's not kindness, it's truth." He took a deep breath, and Clara could see him gathering courage for what he wanted to say next. "I'm not good at talking about feelings. Eleanor used to tease me about it. Said I could forge a perfect horseshoe, but couldn't string together 3 words about what was in my heart." "You don't have to. Let me finish, please." Clara nodded. "When Eleanor died, I thought I'd never feel anything again. I thought the cold had gotten inside me and frozen everything solid, and that's just the way it would be for whatever years I had left." He looked at her, and his dark eyes held something that made Clara's heart beat faster. "But watching you these past months, watching you build something everyone said was impossible, watching you prove them all wrong, it thawed something. Something I thought was dead forever." "Nathaniel, I'm not asking for anything, not yet. But I'd like to know you better, Clara Weston. Not just as a neighbor. Not just as someone who leaves bread on my fence post." His scarred hands tightened on each other. "As something more, if you're willing." Clara reached across the table and took his hands in hers. I'm willing, she said. They were married in September of 1888 in the small wooden church where Clara had first announced her impossible plan. Marcus Holloway gave her away, a role he had asked for with a humility that still surprised her. Dr. Crane served as a witness. Reverend Whitfield, who had once worried about pagan influences, performed the ceremony with evident joy. Ezra served as ring-bearer, his face solemn with the importance of the duty. Copper sat in the front row, his tail wagging throughout the service, his intelligent eyes moving from Clara to Nathaniel and back again as if confirming that all was well. Copper died on a warm afternoon in May of 1897, 14 years after Clara had first found him wandering the canyon as a half-starved pup. He had been slowing down for months. His copper-red fur had faded to rust, and his eyes had grown cloudy with age. But he still followed Ezra everywhere, still stationed himself beneath the cottonwood tree each morning, still raised his head and wagged his tail whenever Clara came near. On that last day, he simply lay down in his favorite spot, the patch of soft grass between the cabin and the barn, and didn't get up again. Clara sat with him as the sun set, stroking his faded fur, remembering all the years he had watched over them. He had been there when Thomas died. He had been there when she built the barn. He had been there through the terrible storm and the long recovery and every moment in between. "Good boy," she whispered as his breathing slowed. "You were such a good boy. The best boy." Copper's tail wagged once, weakly. His cloudy eyes found hers, and in them she saw recognition, love, peace, and then he was gone. They buried him beneath the cottonwood tree, beside the spring that had sustained them all. Ezra, now 15 and nearly as tall as his mother, carved a marker from a piece of sandstone, the same red sandstone that Clara had used to build her barn. Copper, a faithful friend, 1883 to 1897, he remembered. Clara stood at the grave for a long time after Ezra and Nathaniel had gone inside. "Thank you," she said quietly to the evening air, "for everything, for protecting us when we couldn't protect ourselves, for believing in me when no one else did." A breeze rustled the cottonwood leaves, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. Clara wiped her eyes and walked back to the cabin, where her husband and her son were waiting, where the fire was warm and the food was ready, and life, despite everything, went on. In 1923, 36 years after Clara built her barn, researchers from the University of Utah came to study the structure. They measured everything: wall thickness, air temperature, humidity levels, insulation values. They compared her design to conventional structures of the same era and conducted thermal imaging studies that would not have been possible in her time. Their findings were remarkable. Clara's barn was 2.1 times more efficient at maintaining stable temperatures than comparable wooden structures. The thermal mass of the sandstone walls created a natural temperature regulation system that kept the interior warm in winter and cool in summer. The design principles she had used, principles learned from her father and adapted from the ancestral Puebloans, anticipated concepts that modern engineers were only beginning to understand and apply systematically. This structure, the lead researcher wrote in his report, represents a significant achievement in passive design and earth-sheltered building. Built by a widow with no formal engineering training, it incorporates principles that we are only now recognizing as fundamental to sustainable architecture. Mrs. Rivers's work should be studied and celebrated as an example of practical innovation informed by traditional knowledge. Clara was 72 years old when the researchers came. She walked them through the barn herself, explaining every detail, demonstrating techniques she had developed half a century before. Nathaniel, 81 and still sharp as a forge fire, helped where he could. "My wife was a pioneer," he told the researchers proudly, "not just in this canyon, in everything she did." Nathaniel died in 1936, peacefully, in his sleep. Clara found him in the morning, still warm, a slight smile on his face as though he had been dreaming of something beautiful. She buried him beside the cottonwood tree, next to Thomas and Copper, the three most important males in her life, all resting together in the shadow of the barn she had built with her own hands. Clara Weston Rivers died on March the 15th, 1939, at the age of 81. She passed in her sleep, like Nathaniel, like the quiet ending of a story well told. Ezra, who had grown into a strong man with a family of his own, found her in the morning. He didn't cry, not immediately. Instead, he walked to the barn his mother had built, opened the heavy wooden door, and stood in the center of the space she had carved from solid stone. The walls were the same as they had been 52 years ago. The beams had not shifted. The floor was still dry, the temperature still comfortable. The animals, descendants of the original livestock, still content. Ezra placed his hand on the cool stone wall and closed his eyes. "Thank you, Mama," he whispered, "for everything, for never giving up, for teaching me that impossible just means difficult." I want to pause here one last time. Clara Weston's barn still stands. If you go to southeastern Utah, if you know where to look, you can find it. The Historical Society has preserved it now, recognized as a significant example of frontier innovation and traditional building knowledge. But the building itself isn't what matters most. What matters is what it represents. The courage to try something everyone said was impossible. The wisdom to listen to those who came before. The grace to forgive those who doubted. The generosity to share knowledge instead of hoarding it. What matters is that Clara Weston proved something that we all need to remember, especially when the world tells us we can't do something, especially when everyone is laughing, especially when giving up seems like the only sensible choice. She proved that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they trust what they know and refuse to give up. In 1952, 65 years after Clara first struck steel against stone, an old man drove a dusty pickup truck down a canyon road in southeastern Utah. His name was Ezra Weston Rivers. He had taken his stepfather's name when he turned 18. And he was 72 years old. His hair had gone white, his hands were spotted with age, and his joints ached when the weather changed. But his eyes still held the quiet intelligence of the boy who had once held a bucket of iron spikes while his mother built the impossible. Beside him in the truck sat his granddaughter, a girl of 8 with curious eyes and an endless supply of questions. Her name was Clara, after the great-grandmother she had never met. "Grandpa," she said as they rounded the final bend and the canyon opened up before them, "is this where you grew up?" "This is where I learned what matters," Ezra said. He parked the truck in the shade of the cottonwood tree, the same tree, grown massive now, where his mother had anchored her first pulley system all those years ago. The spring still flowed nearby, clear and cold, just as it had flowed for thousands of years before any of them were born. He took his granddaughter's hand and led her toward the canyon wall. The barn was exactly as he remembered. The front wall still stood, solid and true. The sandstone blocks fitted so precisely that you could barely see the mortar between them. The wooden door had been replaced twice over the years, once in 1914, once in 1943. But the hinges were still the original wooden pindles Clara had carved. The alcove behind was unchanged, would always be unchanged because rock did not rot or burn or forget. Ezra pushed open the door and led his granddaughter inside. "Your great-great-grandmother built this," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the stone chamber. "With her own 2 hands, with no help except what she could find or teach herself. Everyone said she was crazy. Everyone said it couldn't be done. Everyone laughed. What happened to them? The people who laughed?" Ezra smiled. "They learned. When the worst storm in 50 years came and destroyed everything they had built, they came here. Your great-great-grandmother took them in. She kept them warm and safe when they had nowhere else to go. And then she taught them how to build the way she had built, so they would never be helpless again. Did they say sorry for laughing at her? Some of them did, and she forgave them." Ezra knelt down beside his granddaughter, placing his weathered hand against the cool stone wall. "She used to say that holding on to anger was like holding on to a hot coal. It only burns the person holding it. She said the best revenge against people who doubt you is not to prove them wrong. It's to help them do better." Young Clara thought about this for a moment. Then she reached out and touched the wall beside her grandfather's hand. "It's warm," she said, surprised. "It's always warm. The stone holds heat from the sun and from the animals and releases it slowly, all day and all night. That's what your great-great-grandmother understood. That's what she built. Will you teach me how to build things like this?" Ezra smiled, the first real smile he had smiled in months, since his wife had passed and left him alone in a house that suddenly felt too big. "Yes," he said, "I'll teach you everything I know. Your great-great-grandmother taught me, and I've taught your father, and now I'll teach you. And someday, you'll teach someone else. That's how it works. That's how the knowledge stays alive." They stood there for a long moment, grandfather and granddaughter, surrounded by walls that had sheltered 4 generations. Outside, the afternoon sun painted the canyon walls in shades of red and gold, the same colors Clara Weston had seen on her first day in this place 72 years ago. The cottonwood tree rustled in a gentle breeze, and somewhere in the distance a bird sang a song that might have been the same song it had sung when a young widow picked up a star drill and began to build something that would outlast them all. Here's what I want you to remember from this story. Not the barn, not the storm, not even the remarkable woman who proved everyone wrong. I want you to remember that there's always another way. When the path everyone else follows leads nowhere, there's always a different path waiting for someone brave enough to take it. I want you to remember that the people who mock you today may need your help tomorrow, and that how you respond in that moment defines who you really are. I want you to remember that knowledge is the most precious gift we can give to those who come after us. Not money, not possessions, not land or buildings or things that can be lost or stolen. Knowledge, skills, wisdom earned through struggle and passed down through love. Clara Weston built a barn into a canyon wall in 1887. But what she really built was proof that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they trust what they know and refuse to give up. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of someone in your own life who built something impossible, I hope you'll share it. Stories like Clara's deserve to be told. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve to inspire the next generation of builders and dreamers and stubborn souls who refuse to accept that something can't be done just because everyone says so. Because in the end, that's all any of us leave behind. The stories of what we built and who we helped and what we chose to do when the world told us we couldn't. Clara Weston chose to keep building, one stone at a time, until the work spoke for itself. Thank you for listening to this story. If it meant something to you, please consider subscribing to our channel and turning on notifications. We have many more stories to tell, stories about ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things, about wisdom passed down through generations, about the courage to be different when everyone says you should be the same. Leave a comment below and tell us, have you ever been laughed at for trying something everyone said was impossible? Did you keep going anyway? We'd love to hear your story. Until next time, remember, stone remembers, and so do we.